We begin with 1 Samuel in chapter 8, verses 4 through 15 and 18 through 22. Hear now God's word to us. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. So appoint for us then a king to govern us, like other nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people, who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. And in that day you will cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and set a king over them." Samuel then said to the people of Israel, "Each of you return home." We then turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, beginning at verse 34, a passage also known as the Greatest Commandment. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So it's a difficult year to talk about faith and politics. Anxiety seems to be a little higher this year. Accusations are made with a little more anger. Mudslinging is at an all-new low. Candidates seem to be less and less desirable and more divisive. I've heard some say that this election year is characterized more by a motivation of who you are voting against rather than who you are voting for. I watched a little snippet on 60 Minutes who had a focus on Ohio and interviewed many people there about the elections. And one lady who's actually run Republican local campaigns for many of the politicians in her area, she phrased it this way. She said, well, I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and then I'm going to vote for my Republican senator to fight everything that she tries to do. Because many people have characterized this election as the lesser of two evils. Now, not everyone believes that. There are some people who believe very strongly in the candidate they are going to vote for, believe they're very well qualified, have no reservations, and think that regardless who that person is running against, they are the best candidate. But I think that's a minority opinion. Most of us can probably resonate with another person who was interviewed on that 60 Minutes broadcast who characterized the election this way. He said, it's kind of like picking seats on the Titanic. You'd rather have other choices. But voting is a privilege that we have been given in this country. This country was founded on the principles of democracy. Women and African Americans had to fight extra hard to get this privilege to vote, and now we all have that opportunity to participate in our elections, regardless of the quality of candidates we feel we have this year. One of them will be our next president. And so we have an opportunity to participate in choosing who that person will be. How do you make that decision? On what basis do you decide who to vote for? Now, most people in this country, I would think, probably make that decision in one of three ways. You either vote for the person who belongs to the party that you believe in, Republican or Democrat, or you vote based on a particular issue that is of extreme importance to you, whether it's pro-life or pro-choice, whether it support gay marriage or against gay marriage, whether it is the right to bear arms or stricter gun control. Whatever the issue is, you can vote according to that issue and the candidate that you agree with on it. Or a third way that people decide how to vote is, well, basically, who is going to look out for my interests? Who's going to benefit me the most? And so if you're a senior citizen, you look at Medicare and Social Security and prescription drug benefit plans. And if you have children, you're going to be interested in education and maybe college tuition. And if you're a small business owner, you want to know what policies are going to allow your business to thrive the most. If you happen to be out of work and you need benefits to get by to feed your children, you're going to want to know if you're going to be able to keep those benefits to feed your family. And so we look at what we are interested in based on where we are in life and what's going to benefit us, and that's how we decide what candidate to vote for. And all those are very human ways in which we cast our vote. But what about faith? Where is God in all that? Do we leave our faith outside when we step into the voting booth and cast our vote? Does our faith have anything to say about what happens on Tuesday? Does God give us any guidance? Do we seek God's will at all in any of this? How does God want us to vote? And before we can even get to that set of questions, there's an even more fundamental question than that, which is, does God care? Does God care who our leaders are? Or whether or not it's Trump or Clinton in the White House for the next 4 years? Does God care about our political system? And in order to get any kind of glimpses into the answers of those questions, I want us to look again at that passage in 1 Samuel. Because at the very beginning of the life of the Israeli people, this nation of Israel, God was their political system. God was their king, literally, their ruler. God led them out of Egypt by a pillar of fire, by a cloud. And God handpicked people to kind of be his representatives, leaders, judges, prophets. So we have Joshua, we have Deborah, and we have Samuel. But we get to a point in Samuel's career when he's getting on in years, he's ready for retirement, and Israel's at a crossroads. Because the problem is that Samuel's sons are neither wise nor worthy nor interested in being their father's successor. So instead of praying and asking God to send another prophet to guide them and lead them and be kind of God's spokesperson, the elders have a different idea. Hey, Samuel, why don't you appoint a king? Every other nation has a king. We want a king too. And then the king will lead us and fight our battles and protect us, and we'll be like all the other nations. Well, Samuel didn't like this idea very much. I guess he probably felt it's kind of like turning your back on God. If God is your king, and here you have the Israeli people saying, yeah, well, divine king, that's okay. We want a human king. We're going to trust more in a human king than in God. So Samuel takes the matter before God and says, all right, here's what the people want. And God tells Samuel, all right, listen to the people, but first be sure to warn them of all the dangers and all the problems that a human king is going to bring. So Samuel goes back to the people and tells them, all right, you want a king? Here's what you can expect. Your king is going to take all your sons and send them off to battle. Going to take your daughters and put them to work in his kingdom. It's going to take 10% of your vineyards and your cattle and the oil and everything else that you have. I think our kingdom takes more than 10% these days, doesn't it? And here's what you can expect. And by the way, after all this happens, when you cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, God will not hear you, says Samuel. And despite all the warning, despite being well aware of what to expect with a human king, the people say they still want one. And God and Samuel say, okay, but don't say we didn't warn you. And Samuel goes out to find a young man named Saul. Now, the first lesson we can learn from this passage is be careful what you ask for, because God might give it to you. But maybe a more important lesson, at least for today, is God does seem to care how we govern ourselves. God seems to care who our leaders are and how they're going to treat the people they rule over. Because you see, God knew that human leaders were imperfect, that they are going to rule for power, they're going to rule for selfish motives, they're going to rule for their party and their supporters and their lobbyists and anything else except for the good of all people. They would lie and manipulate and cheat and steal and commit adultery and put other gods before the God of Israel. And that's why God was trying to persuade the people not to have this human king, because they would be human, imperfect. And the kings and the leaders that we read about in Scripture from then on prove the point. Kings, presidents are imperfect. They were 3,000 years ago, and they are today. And our candidates seem to excel in imperfection. So does God care then about who we vote for? Given that all people are imperfect anyway, given that all people are sinful and selfish to some extent, that they will rule for self-interests, does it really matter who's in office? Because they're not going to do God's will all the time. And some might come to the conclusion, no, it doesn't matter who's in office. But what if we asked ourselves a different set of questions? Does God care when people are out of work because their jobs have been sent overseas? Does God care if thousands of people are killed in war because of a decision made in the Oval Office? Does God care if senior citizens have to choose between buying medicine or buying food? Does God care if our schools are safe and if children are being educated? Does God care if people are getting adequate medical treatment or if they have to go bankrupt because of medical bills? Does God care if that person who loses their job is able to receive some kind of help or benefits in order to get them through a difficult time and feed their family? Does God care if people feel safe in this country due to internal or external violence? You see, I believe that God does care about people in all these situations, about everyone in our country. And so because of that, I believe God does care about our political leaders and the decisions that those leaders make that impact millions and millions of people. Whether it's seniors or kids or minorities or the working class or the wealthy 1% or the small business owners, whoever, that we are all God's children. And God cares about the decisions that are made that impact the lives of all these people. So does God care how we vote? Yes, because God cares about the people who are affected by those political decisions that are made. So then, how does God want us to vote? And whenever we want to ask ourselves about how we live our lives, we look to the life and teaching of Jesus. And Jesus boiled our purpose down to two main commandments. If all you need to know how to live are these two commandments, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So what can we learn as we take those two commandments into the voting booth with us on Tuesday? How does loving the Lord our God impact our vote? More than you might think. Because the term Lord is actually a political term. Lord refers to master, owner, emperor, ruler. Kurios is the word used for Lord. It's a political term because it was a term used for Caesar. In the early church, when you said Jesus is Lord, you were directly contradicting a well-known phrase that said Caesar is Lord. So by saying Jesus is Lord, you were making a statement that I am not ruled by Caesar. I am ruled by Jesus. I am not Caesar's subject or citizen. I am Jesus' citizen. He rules me. He is my king. In fact, we call Jesus King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So if Jesus is our ruler, then our king, our ruler, is not going to be elected on Tuesday. We put our trust and hope in our King Jesus. And God will still be Lord on Wednesday, November 9th. God will still be Lord on January 20th, on Inauguration Day, and God will still be Lord 4 years from now when this presidential term is over. And so we put our hope and trust and faith in God. And what that means is we don't have to get caught up in all the fear and all the stress and all the moaning and lamenting and panicking and people packing their bags, maybe moving to Canada if a certain candidate gets elected because the world's going to fall apart. We won't be saved by a political leader. But the world won't fall apart because of a political leader. God remains in control. And God will reign and rule whatever happens on Tuesday. So how does God want us to vote? With a sense of peace, knowing that God will still reign and God will still be in control, regardless of what happens this week. So does it really matter who is in that office? If our hope and trust and faith is in God, our ruler, our king, does it matter who the president or other leaders are? Well, we were given a second commandment, which is to love your neighbor. And one way we can love our neighbor certainly is by setting the tone for the civil discourse and the conversations that exist. We can love our neighbor by looking across party lines and seeing a brother or sister in Christ, another human being, another child of God. For loving Christians don't judge or demonize or divide or degrade each other because we're not voting the same way. But maybe just as important, loving our neighbor means that we vote for the candidate who we believe is best for all the people in this country. Remember when we first started, we were talking about how most people choose to vote. It's very self-focused. Who belongs to my party, who believes in my issues, and who is best for me? But as Christians, maybe our focus is more on the people in our entire nation, not just ourselves. Maybe we look at all people and say, what is best for us as an entire group? As a nation together. Because Jesus spent the most amount of time with those who were hurting, those who were needy, those who were outcasts. He said, whatever you do for the least of these who are my brothers and sisters, you do for me. So as we think about our whole country and our whole nation, maybe we especially keep in mind those who might be considered the least of these. And how do we vote? Keeping in mind the needs and having all people benefit from whoever the next president will be. How does God want us to vote? We're not going to agree on which box to check on Tuesday, and that's okay. But what if we're all asking similar questions? What if we all can say, Jesus is Lord? And it's going to be okay. And our hope is in him, not our political leaders. And we let go of whatever fear or stress seems to have grabbed a lot of this country. We can vote with a sense of peace. And my hope and my prayer is that we will reach across party lines to recognize we're all human beings trying to do the best we can to figure out who our leaders should be. To love our neighbors. And yes, to love the neighbors in the other party. And finally, we love our neighbors as we think about investing ourselves in politics as a way to love our neighbor. How does my vote help me love my neighbor? What are ways in which we can keep in mind all people when we make that important decision? Because I believe God does care who our political leaders are, because God cares about the people who will be impacted by the decisions that are made. And so may our vote reflect less on allegiance to a particular party or who's going to benefit us personally. And maybe our thoughts can gravitate toward the nation as a whole, particularly those who might call the least of these, and how we can help create a country where there's liberty and justice for all people. To sum it up, how does God want us to vote? Love the Lord, your God. Love your neighbor, and vote accordingly.